Welcome to Trust But Verify, Maintaining Democracy in Spite of Information Countermeasures. I'm Allie Mellen. I'm a security strategist in the office of the CSO at Cyber, and for the past 3 years, I've been working with federal and state law enforcement, including the FBI, DHS, CISA, and others, in order to figure out how we can improve our processes around elections. And a big part of that has been not so much what's happening with the voting machines themselves, but everything around the voting machines, everything around Election Day, whether it's weeks before or the day of. We're thinking about things like disinformation, how people can cause a traffic jam the day of, if there's an attack on the electric grid, things like that. And so what we're going to start talking about in this talk is all of those different things, and hopefully get you guys brainstorming different ways that you could both attack and, of course, defend an election. So I want to take a step back and start by talking about what's truly critical to our daily lives, because this is way more related to voting than people really think. And the way that I like to categorize this is through Maslow's hierarchy of needs. As we know, this includes physiological needs at the base, things like air and water and food. And as we work our way up, we're seeing things like safety, personal security, employment, all of these things that are really important so that we as human beings can have a life. And of course, the next step in the pyramid is that friendship and intimacy, this sense of connection, and then esteem, which is either self-esteem or self-respect or the respect of others, things like status and recognition. And this is all leading towards the top of the pyramid, which is self-actualization and the desire to become the most that one can be. And the question that I want you guys to be thinking about is, where does voting fit into this? What does it mean to be able and be enabled to go out and vote? And how does that affect your daily life? So that's what we're talking about. First, we'll dive into the defender perspective and really see the state of play today. Then we'll go into the daily life of a voter, what that looks like, and jump into the attacker perspective, trying to identify different ways that an attacker might use Election Day to their advantage. Then we'll get into what you could do to actually stop an election, as well as how we can use this information to protect our elections, because that's the whole point of this talk, is not about just attacking an election, but really about making the effort to defend it. So let's talk about that defender perspective. According to the DHS, election infrastructure is defined as the voter registration databases, the voting systems, anything surrounding voting equipment. It's a very narrow definition that really does just include that IT infrastructure that we traditionally think of and traditionally test as well. You'll see at events like DEF CON and others with voting villages, a lot of it is around testing the actual voting equipment. But my question is that all? And through the course of these exercises, what I've learned is that that is really not all. There is much more to voting and protecting voting than solely the actual election equipment that the government is either producing or is being manufactured by someone. And I think of this through what I call the voter hierarchy of needs. And actually, each level of this is in some way linked back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But in order to convey the things that we really need before we truly feel comfortable and feel safe enough to go vote and motivated enough. So we're starting with things like the physiological needs. If you fear for your life or for your property, you're pretty unlikely to go vote because you have priorities that outrank those of actually going to vote. Similarly, safety comes into play, whether it's your personal safety, your family's safety, safety with your job. All of these things can at times be more important than going out to vote on that one election day. Belonging also comes into play. If you are not feeling like you belong in the country that you are in, or if you don't feel like you're a part of the community, you're much less likely to go out and vote because it doesn't seem to matter as much to you. The direction of the country, you don't feel personally invested in that. And then, of course, esteem. Things like if you don't feel that your vote matters, which at least in the United States, a lot of people do feel that way, then you are much less likely to go vote. And ultimately, self-actualization, both being the best person that you can be and also making sure that you are contributing to the best country that you can have. All of these components are so critical to actually making sure that someone goes out and votes. And it's it can be very challenging for everyone to have all of these needs met and feel comfortable voting on a regular day. So that's the complete hierarchy of needs. But what that really is making me think about is when you're thinking about election infrastructure and you think about all of the things that voters need in order to actually make it to the polls and actually go vote, feel like their vote matters, it really challenges this idea that that's all there is to election infrastructure. And all of these systems that we are now supposed to protect in order to make sure that people feel safe and motivated to vote become a target and become a huge target. Because if you take out any of these layers, you are affecting someone's ability and will to go vote, depending on the scenario. And in a nation like the US, 40% of eligible citizens don't vote at all. Any kind of voter suppression has an impact on the election, any. And so if you even attack one of these layers a little bit, you are likely to affect the vote. So there are other elements of election infrastructure that we really need to consider. Things like those that will affect voter suppression, things that will affect your faith in the government, and other factors related to that. There are ways to influence election beyond actually changing the voter rolls. And voter suppression is an attack on democracy, especially when perpetrated by a foreign government. So now I want to jump into the attacker perspective. And as people in the information security industry, we know that red teaming isn't evil, that it's really important to consider the attacker perspective so that you can bring your best defense, so that you can be the most prepared. But it's really important to call that out because especially when it comes to these political issues, they can feel very charged. And it can seem like a really bad thing if you're going in and you're trying to test what would affect an election. But this is all just to make us better and to make us more prepared and to be considering more aspects of election security. So with that in mind, let's jump in. In a lot of cases, especially when we're dealing with nation states, what we're seeing is they are looking to do three main things. The first is, of course, to gain power. The second is to spread a particular ideology. And the third is to maintain that global recognition and support that they may already have. We've seen this time and time again throughout history, not just with elections, but even more generally. Nations try to raise their power to a superpower level or to maintain their superpower level or to spread whatever belief system that they hold. And in order to do that, what we're seeing is that they can target three different layers. And I talk about these as the infrastructure layer, the information layer, and the ethos layer. Now, we're going to start by looking at some examples from that ethos plane. And that ethos plane is really about the belief system. Attacks that are really targeting how people feel, what their beliefs are, and really trying to affect that. And I want to jump into some historical examples and some present day examples and potential things that could happen. Keep in mind that not all of these are even going to be election related directly, but they give a great example of how one could use these tactics on election day, or how they could ultimately affect a vote like months or years later, just with these tactics. So let's start with the Italian elections of 1948. This was a case of election interference on both sides. The US government was intent on psychological warfare and pushing democracy, and millions of dollars was going to Christian Democratic and right-wing socialist parties. This was a massive propaganda campaign between the Soviet Union and the United States, where it was communism versus democracy, socialism versus democracy. And what they were able to do just in Italy is to ultimately change the perception of that election to democracy versus totalitarianism, to Christianity versus atheism, to America versus the Soviet Union, and to abundance versus starvation, all through this propaganda. And the United States found this to be so successful that they repeated this process in Guatemala, in South Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and Indonesia, and many, many more. So this is one example of something that just through propaganda, which at the time was not using the internet, obviously, because it was so long ago, was able to influence an election and able to influence multiple elections. And what's so fascinating about this is now we have an even easier way to communicate these things to a group of individuals, to a country, thanks to the internet. Another example is from Moscow, where they were urging the American Communist Party to pursue revolutionary regime change in the United States. It was the equivalent of the democracy promotion that was later pursued by Washington. And then, of course, there's the 1996 Chinese influence on the US election. Now, this is a multifaceted attack on our democracy. But needless to say, $300,000 was sent from a Chinese general interested in influencing the US presidential election. They were trying to funnel money to the Clinton campaign. So this had immediate physical impact, and it also had an attack that was meant to impact the belief system, because all of a sudden, Americans were aware of a situation in which their politicians were being bought off by foreign generals and people of foreign influence. Now, let's look at some present day attacks that we've seen that are specifically meant to affect an outcome of the election. And we're going to talk a lot about the 2016 US presidential election in this. We'll start with social media influence. So on the right, you can see an example of a Facebook advertisement that was put on by people in a different country and is meant to push this image of divisiveness in the US and make people actively think that there's this conflict going on, whether or not there truly is. And of course, in some cases there is, but the extent of it is amplified by this country pushing this message. And then on the left, you can see an example from Twitter that is both an ethos attack and an information attack. It's telling people that they can vote from home by texting their vote. And of course, this is not actually possible, at least in the United States. But with a year like this one, with the pandemic and everything going on, something like this might seem quite appetizing to people who don't want to go wait in line at a polling place or don't understand the rules of mail-in voting and just want to get it out of the way really easily. Now, we're also seeing, I'd be really remiss to not talk about disinformation campaigns that are happening. And what's important to think about here is that we have a lot of social media companies who are either unwilling or have been unwilling in the past to take into account election security and the importance of maintaining integrity in elections into their platforms. And I think that this is where I started to really realize that is not just the government's job to protect our elections. It is also the job of those individuals in those countries that have these businesses that have so much influence. And so quotes like these are a cop-out in order to make this company seem like they're doing an okay job. But in reality, it is everyone's job to help protect the institutions that we believe in and that we value, whether or not those institutions are democracy. Now, let's take a look at the information plane. This is things that are more directly related to disinformation, things that are all about what people actually think is the truth and what people see and perceive as their reality. And I want to start with a really interesting example that I certainly didn't know about before doing all of this work, which is the foundations of the United States. And what's fascinating about this is that America was actually founded on the premise of a conspiracy theory, where the British were trying to enslave us. Sam Adams argued that Britain's taxations were part of an elaborate conspiracy to ultimately enslave American colonists. He spread that information and other early disinformation through pamphlets and speeches that had information that he knew was completely not true. And he also used the Boston Massacre to further this. He actually handed out pamphlets with disinformation in them. This is a very early example of the disinformation campaigns that we see today, just in a different format. And this was actually the foundations of America, which, as we all know, is one of the countries that's truly struggling with disinformation at this point in time. Next up is a story I actually really love that's fascinating about the CIA and the propaganda asset inventory. So, of course, in the 1950s and 60s, during the Cold War era, the CIA was spreading a lot of propaganda in order to further the US message. A lot of countries were, truthfully. But in this case, a couple of the formats that they were doing it in was, for example, Radio Free Asia. And what they realized is that they wanted to affect the sentiment of people in Taiwan, but they realized that people in Taiwan, private citizens, most likely did not have access to a radio because it was so early on. And so they tied radios to balloons and tried to fly them over to Taiwan. Needless to say, the wind changed and took them in a different direction, but it was still a fascinating instance of how they're really trying to figure out ways to combine that infrastructure and information plane to spread disinformation or propaganda or whatever you want to call it. Another example that's really interesting is a magazine that the CIA used to publish fake stories in. This was called Forum World Features, and the magazine actually became so popular that it started to be distributed in the US. And so the CIA had to be very careful to make sure that they weren't placing false stories in the US version, which to me is like horrifying. But some very interesting examples of the problems that they ran into, and also the ways and the methods that they used very early on in order to spread this propaganda. And of course, hardly a left-wing newspaper in Europe wasn't financed directly by Moscow in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Similarly, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, we saw US radio broadcasting in Russia and in Moscow that was all rock music, lots of Elton John, lots of the Beatles. This was stuff that Russians couldn't get anywhere else. But it was often followed by quote unquote editorial content, which Soviet authorities considered disinformation. So this is an example, more recent example, that specifically does talk about a Ukrainian election. And what's fascinating about this is that several days before the Ukrainian election, attackers were able to compromise the CEC network and disable vote counting. This automatically results in people losing faith in their government, of course. But then on election day, they followed it up. This was 4 days later, May 25th, 2014. The attackers followed it up with a constant denial of service attack on that same CEC website. 12 minutes before the polls closed, the attackers posted a picture of Dmitry Yarosh, the former leader of the right sector, on the CEC website, claiming that he won the election. And then just like that, it was shared by Russian media immediately. This was meant to cause confusion, make people believe that someone had won who potentially had not, and generally to make people lose faith in their government's websites and whether they could trust their government's websites. Now, let's look at some examples of communication attacks that happened, especially in this last election in the US. We'll start on the right, which is an example where a text message was sent to a voter saying, here's your polling location, here are the times you can go. Only problem is, this is not a text message from the government. This is actually a text message from an attacker, and there's no polling location where they listed a location. So they're intentionally sending someone to the wrong address. Because ultimately, if you see this text, you see what you suspect is your polling location, you're probably going to try to go there. And if you get there and it's not actually a polling location, one, you're going to be confused. And two, you'll be much more likely to not try to find this magical polling location that you now have no idea where it is. And then on the left, you can see a message claiming to be from President Trump is not, that's shaming this person into submitting their vote. So that's intentionally meant to push people to vote, even when perhaps it's not something that they've done, or they have done it, or they haven't voted for Trump, whatever the case may be. And lastly, and I think most interestingly, although in many ways very sad, we're going to talk about the infrastructure plane. And again, starting out with some of those historical examples that don't have a cyber component, but could easily have one, given the current state of play. So we're going to start with the assassination of Lumumba. He was the prime minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and he was actually assassinated in 1961. And while this may not seem directly related, he was actually elected in 1960, which was when the DRC actually had first gained independence. So their first PM is assassinated a year after being in office. And it turns out that the people who assassinated him were actually a cohort of American and Belgian individuals associated with the governments there. For a brand new nation to be attacked in this way by two large countries and is like completely politically fracturing for this independent nation, and can cause a lot of strife, because most likely if you see your prime minister assassinated after your first year of independence, you're not going to have much faith in the government, and you're not going to have much faith that the people you elect are even going to be allowed to live by other governments. Another horrifying and very good example of this is with the Indonesian elections. This was in 1965, and the Communist Party had finished fourth in an Indonesian election. They were offered proportional representation in the government, and the United States secretly supported the purge of suspected communists because it wasn't in their interests, in Western interests. And so thousands to millions, they're not really sure the total count, died over the course of months, and the military took over as the most powerful institution. And so this is the type of thing that obviously it has an immediate impact because a huge portion of the population is just wiped out, but it also terrifies the public. I would not want to speak freely about my point of view. I would not want to or feel safe going to vote, because again, you have a superpower that is attacking your institution in order to make sure that they have things their way. And these are the type of things that can really destroy people's faith in their government and really destroy their belief that their vote even matters and that what they want to do even matters. And though this one, again, is not an election day attack, it's a really good representation of what could happen, and it does have that cyber component. So in 2007, there was this group in Estonia that decided they were going to move a Red Army soldier out of the center of Estonia and into a Soviet cemetery. This was a government. And immediately as they were doing this, fake news started to spread with Russian news reports that they were destroying the statue, and they were also desecrating some graves and destroying some Soviet graves. This fake information resulted in 2 nights of riots and looting. 156 people were injured. 1 person died. 1,000 people were detained. But the really interesting part is that at the same time, the attackers were perpetrating an infrastructure attack. They were giving a denial of service attack to banks, media outlets, and governments so that people could not take cash out of ATMs. They couldn't do any online banking. Government employees were unable to communicate through email, and newspapers and broadcasters could not deliver the news. So they were able to consistently spread this misinformation through Russian news reports. The Estonians could not report on the news, and they could not actually communicate between each other to help calm down some of the rioting and looting. And this is a great quote about that night that shows that cyber is really just meant to, it's a tool to spread confusion. It's a tool to prevent us from calming people down and from making sure that everyone is heard and seen, but not necessarily getting to the point of actual violence. But what's amazing is that through these little activities, you can really result in some severe damage and potential violence. So let's look at some potential with the electric grid. In 2003, a 4-day power outage left at least 100 people in the US and Canada dead. Now, this, when the electric grid goes down, it can seem like a minor inconvenience, but it can actually leave people dead, unfortunately. And if an attacker was able to attack the electric grid, they could not only stop a person from feeling motivated to vote, because you're going to be more focused on what in your fridge is going bad and whatever you need power for that you no longer have it, but they can also cause division by, say, targeting specific regions of the country that they know lean one way politically, and making people feel like this is not just an attack on the country, it's an attack on one specific group within the country. And I also want to talk about transit, because transit is really, really key when it comes to voting. In 2016, San Francisco's transit system was infected with ransomware. And this is a great example where a lot of people go to vote after work. And before pre-pandemic, a lot of people took the train into work. So say I'm taking the train into work one day, I'm on my phone, most likely seeing and or reading some type of disinformation on Twitter by accident. And I make it through my day and I tell myself I'm going to go vote after work. So I get done with work, I go to take the train, but I can't take the train. It's shut down. What do you do in this scenario? Because a lot of people would be much more inclined to think, ugh, now I have to find my way home, instead of, ugh, now I have to find my way home and out to vote. So it's just something to consider, that all of these roadblocks lead to people being less motivated to vote. And we can see that we have attacks that are not only across all of these layers, but across all of the layers of the pyramid as well. So let's dive into the defender perspective so we can really talk about these attacks in the context of what processes we can make, and how we can actually defend against them. Where does all of this lead us? And when we think about this, right now we have this very narrow definition of election security, all about election infrastructure. Again, the voter rolls, the IT infrastructure around that. And what we've seen is it's led to comments like this from high up people in multiple governments. We cannot exclude such activities in Germany either, which just saying that without any context, without any reference to support, like to help the people actually not fall for these fake stories and these distortions, is really, it just makes people feel like there's no hope in the situation, which is not the way that you want to feel about your government's ability to protect you and to protect your institutions. Similarly, we see presidents and leaders of countries calling elections a scam, which has a huge impact on people's belief that their government is truly giving them the opportunities that they deserve. And even with top congressional Democrats specifically saying that this is a threat, which I think is great that we're calling it out, but we need something to say, here's what you can do to help stop it. Because just calling it out on its own is just going to affect people's beliefs in their institutions more and not actually offer a solution that brings people together. And that brings me to my point of where should we actually be going, because we have this problem, but we're not meeting the problem with a strong solution by limiting our definition of election security so much. What we really need is a more comprehensive definition that talks about things like communications and social media and transit, the electric grid, other things that I haven't even considered here and that I'm hoping you guys are going to consider and really think about in your daily lives. And so in order to get there, I want you guys to think about what your election day looks like. Do you vote before work? Do you mail in your ballot? I know I'm mailing in my ballot because I don't want to deal with the polling place during a pandemic. Normally, I would vote before work, but how do modern events change how you choose to vote? Are you tracking your mail-in ballot? Are you on Twitter? And do you fact check the messages that you see there? These are all really important questions, and it's a grind. It's about every day making sure that you are moving up that pyramid towards self-actualization, towards being the best you can be, towards taking in the information that is factual and true. So with all of that in mind, how would you attack an election? And if you can think about this, what would you do to actually impact an election? Would you attack an electric grid? Would you attack the transit system? Would you release a deep fake of a candidate saying something that they didn't say, or just editing a video in order to make it sound like a candidate says something, but it's wildly out of context? And what could you do and how would you attack when you had a whole government behind you to support you, a whole nation state? These are the questions that we need to be asking ourselves now so we're prepared later. And use that information to think about what you can do to help defend your country. So the question that this leaves us with is, what can we do to protect democracy? What can we do to protect whatever institution we are a part of in our country? And the key to that, regardless of whether you're in a democracy or not, is to secure your systems, whether or not you're in the government or not. Because as we saw with a lot of these methods, they use equipment that is not controlled by the government. It's controlled by the private sector. Things like communications channels, that's controlled by, in many places, that's controlled by the private sector. Many types of transit are controlled by the private sector. And similarly with the electric grid. So this is not just a government problem, and we need to start thinking about it more comprehensively as a problem for everyone. And if you hold a particular belief, you need to make sure that you're defending that belief through securing your systems. If you're a business owner or if you work for a large organization, this is one of the things that's actually going to make the difference when it comes to our elections. The second is to, if you are able, work with the government, because having a partnership, and this is one thing that I saw in these exercises with the government, having a partnership really makes it easier for them to reach out and say, this is my point of contact at this organization. They're undergoing a cyber attack that's affecting election day, things like that. Very important. And then the last thing is to fight misinformation wherever you see it. If you see misinformation, don't engage with it, report it, and move on. If you see someone you know spreading misinformation, try to understand their point of view, hear them, and then talk to them about what the reality and what the facts actually look like. So thank you so much for attending. I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll also check out the chat. Thank you.